I'm going to report to you an amazing finding. I've never said this publicly, but I just flew in from England, literally about an hour ago. And there I was teaching at the Royal College of Physicians in London. And we passed a very significant mark that I've been waiting to pass, which is I've asked 100,000 mental health professionals from all over the planet face to face the following question. Have you ever had a lecture at any time in your training, except if they were lectured by me, that defined what the mind is? So I passed the 100,000 person mark, face to face, asking people. So it was a big moment. And at the Royal College of Physicians, the number was actually the same as it's been everywhere on this planet for the last 7 or 8 years when I've been asking this question. And what do you think the percentage is of mental health professionals who've had one lecture even that defined what the mental is of their profession? Why would you say zero? You're right. It's actually about 2%. 2 to 5%. Look, they said that. I heard you. 2 to 5%. Now, how many of you think that's really odd? I mean, this is to see if you're awake. This was an amazing moment because when I first started asking, it was almost like a joke. Like I'm a psychiatrist, and I woke up one day and I realized, well, wait a second, an iatrist is a caretaker, like a podiatrist is a caretaker of the pod, the foot. A psychiatrist is the caretaker of the psyche, which is the soul and the spirit, the intellect, and the mind. I thought of as synonyms. And I realized I never got one lecture on that, so I started just asking the other professions that I was dealing with and other psychiatrists, and it turns out, as you can see, that 98% of mental health professionals have never had a lecture on the mind. Now, you can then sit down with philosophers of mind and find out, unfortunately, it's the same thing. They don't have a definition of mind, even if they publish books with mind in it. You can even talk to scientists who have mind in the title of their research centers, and they intentionally don't have a definition of mind because that's why they're studying it, because they don't know what it is. So what I'm going to offer you is a working definition of mind that doesn't have a competing definition, so I can't say people are at war with it with other definitions, because it turns out that whether you're in the field of philosophy of mind or psychology, believe it or not, or mental health, there isn't a definition of mind. There literally is the absence of a definition with all sorts of statements like we don't know what it is, it's a mystery, if we define it, we'll limit ourselves. So what I'm about to offer you is a view that I think is very relevant for everything you're doing with cities and climate and behavior. And to me, without this definition of mind as a mental health professional, if I got a call from Jonathan and I didn't have this working definition, I would have even been more firm, which would be the right thing. I would have been stronger in my saying, I'm not going to come because I have nothing to offer. But as you'll see from this definition of the mind, you can see why someone interested in climate change issues or interested in behavior and certainly interested in cities would be interested in using this operational definition of mind. So let me just tell you where it comes from so you understand the framework and you'll see the implications of it, because I think they're pretty potentially useful, because I know you don't want to just talk about theory in this workshop, in this gathering, this think tank. You want to talk about being practical. And so I'm offering you kind of the conceptual foundation to look extremely deeply at things like cultural evolution. And one of the research centers I run is called the Center for Culture, Brain, and Development. And we're very interested in how cultural forces shape synaptic connections in the brain. And so we actually literally put people in brain scanners to see how do cultural influences shape their brain. And as you'll see, that has everything to do with what we're about to talk about. So that these aren't just like theoretical things, you can actually show that. So if you're agents of cultural change, then you want to really think about how are the individuals really experiencing a mental process, whatever that is, we have to define it, so that their behavior will be changed. Does that make sense? So in the last presentation, you heard face-to-face interactions somehow made a big difference. Or if you look at David Gerson's work, face-to-face connections, relationships are huge. Even if you study something like teaching a kid language, You know, there have been huge studies that show if you just try to teach a kid language with a computer, it doesn't work. You do the same thing pretty much with a human being, and it works. So you start wondering, well, why would that be the case? So here's the definition. First of all, the word is kind of funny, isn't it? Mind. When you think of mind, what comes to your mind? The brain, right. And so in modern times, people would say the mind is just the output of the brain, right? How many of you have heard that? Okay, not many. Wow, that's interesting. Well, so what for the others of you, what would the mind be? So it would involve consciousness, okay? So consciousness. And if we said, just to take it a little further, what is consciousness? Awareness. Excellent. Awareness, self-awareness, awareness of other. And what's awareness? Now, careful. This is a slippery slope.
Well, there's a boundary that things are different from each other. I mean, I think that's part of what mind is to me, is the recognition that there's a separation between...
Oh, self and other.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Now, that'll be really, really important to earmark that. So there's something about this thing called awareness that has an awareness of self and awareness of other. And the reason I say it's a slippery slope, because in this very building, we've had week-long retreats to look at that one question. What is awareness? And after a week of some of the brightest people you can imagine being here, there is no answer. So I don't want to fool you and say, well, I know the secret answers. No, the fact is, these are these incredibly exciting questions with profound implications for practical application, but we're not going to come up with an answer to ultimately what awareness is. But we would say that the mind includes awareness or consciousness. What else does mind include?
Storage.
And storage of something, right? Storage of life experiences. You want to store them. We call that memory. Absolutely. So it includes memory and processing. So some people call that thinking or, reasoning or stuff like that. So there's some kind of processing. So what's that?
Presence.
And presence. Okay, terrific. So what's presence? Now remember, don't worry if you don't have answers, because no one has any answers. That's the good news. There are no answers, so you can't be wrong. Yes, what's presence?
Being there. Then you go into all the words we've already used. Consciousness, awareness.
Exactly. So there is something about presence that's profoundly important. So if you have someone, for example, who's about to throw a plastic bottle in the trash can rather than the recycle bin, at that moment, what's the mental process you would all be very concerned about? Being present. Yeah, is this person present? Or what's the opposite of presence? Absence. Okay, well that's good, right? So absence of awareness, right? But then how would the person throw the thing in the trash can and not be aware? So they could do it automatically, right? Or unconsciously, right? So we use the word automatic. So there's a nice phrase, automatic pilot, or amazingly for this conversation, people use the word mindless. Isn't that interesting? So if someone's taking a plastic bottle and they actually are given the option and they throw it in a trash can, we say they're mindless. But they've got a mind. It just isn't the kind of mind you want them to have, right? So we pejoratively say they're mindless. Right? So, okay, so there's something about mind we'll get into. All right, so if we put mind like this on here, and so far we've said that, one of the guesses was that mind somehow relates to this thing called brain, bless you, relates to a brain. We said, well, there's something about brain activity and mind activity that maybe they're the same thing, right? Or maybe not. And then another thing we were talking about was the idea that face-to-face something matters, and when you have a face-to-face interaction with someone, what do we call that? A relationship. We call it a relationship. So what I want you to think about for a moment, and you'll see where this is going to build up to something that's actually relevant, even if it seems a little abstract at this moment. We have a triangle here. You imagine that's a point there. A triangle with three entities. And what I would like you to just reflect on in this very moment from your own personal experience or your scholarly pursuits or your intuition, whatever, how do these three things, relationships, brain, and mind, why would they be on one figure? Because I put them there. Excellent. That's the only reason. Let's go on to the next point. Right. They're interrelated. Okay, how are they interrelated? Yes?
You sort of need each one to live, right? So your brain is sort of the physical, the relationship is your outer body experience with others, and then your mind might be the separation between the physical and the others that would be you.
So the mind might be the separation of
Not necessarily the separation,
but something that connects them.
The physical to the outer.
Okay, great. So we have these three things, and let's try to define them. Let's start with the brain, because that's actually, believe it or not, the easiest one. So if I tell you that we have a center at UCLA where we actually study synaptic connections, and we study the way cultural practices and societies influence synaptic connections, what is that about? How could that possibly happen?
The brain is an electrochemical.
And we get funding for it too, yeah. What's that? I don't mean like how does it happen funding, but yeah, go ahead.
The brain's an electrochemical organ.
Okay, excellent. So the brain is an electrochemical organ, right? So how familiar are you with brain anatomy and stuff? Because I'm going to go into a lot of detail. Raise your hand if you're familiar. Okay, so I'm going to bring everybody up to speed. So just to do the relationship brain-mind thing first, let's just start with the brain. So you know, if you did it really fast, you would have it somewhat look like that. Let's give the person, I don't know, face. And so here's the face of this person. Now you see why I'm not in art school. My daughter would be so embarrassed by what I just did. This is a nightmare. Okay, so you have this thing. Now in the skull, you've got this brain up here. Now here are the crucial take-home messages. It is an organ that has cells in it, neurons and supportive cells called glial cells. And one of the things it does is electrochemical energy transmission. That's basically what it's all about. Long lengths connect to each other, where there are 100 billion neurons. And the connections among those neurons are shaped by both genes and experience. This is the key thing. And the experience that a culture provides or a city creates that encourages this person with this brain to experience, let's say, interconnectedness in communities or not, will make a big difference. So when I was in London, I had to walk to work to this place, the college where I was teaching, and I was walking to work, and there, have you been to London recently? They have bicycles that you just stick your credit card in and you hop on a bike. It's the most amazing thing. I mean, I wish they had helmets too, because especially in London, it was kind of felt like an idiotic thing to do. But anyway, I did it. But it was incredible how easy it was to ride a bicycle. And the few times I had to ride a taxi cab, they hated those bicycle things because they said they're losing money because everyone is jumping on those things and riding. It was a whole different thing that this city created this experience where I could actually be riding along with other Londoners to work. And a bunch of us were riding on these Barclays bikes. I mean, it was fantastic. And all around the city, there were car club places where you could only park a car that was a community shared car. It was really incredible. And even just those reminders in my brain responding to that experience was realizing I'm a part of a community where I'm sharing this bike with somebody. In fact, I could even hop in a car and share a car. So different from, I can just speak from my own town, Los Angeles, where everything is yours. You get in your car, and someone better not bump your car, and the shape of your car means how good you're doing in your material life or some crazy stuff like that. But anyway, so you can see where even little pieces or big pieces of a city like that start shaping a person's feeling of membership, which we're going to talk about in a moment. So anyway, the key thing is that experience, in addition to genes, shapes the connections of this brain. And the issue of presence, for example, we have studies, some of them emanating from this very room, of something called mindful awareness, where you can now show that if you have people train the focus of attention, another aspect of mind, you can change the structure of the brain within even just 8 weeks. And there's some profoundly important implications that we're going to talk about in a few moments. Anyway, so that's kind of the brain part. So what should we do next? Let's do relationships. If the brain allows for an embodied electrochemical energy flow, which is never just in the skull, but it extends throughout the whole body, it's an embodied flow. We'll call it brain, but it's really the brain in the body. And I always used to say embodied brain, but I have a 17-year-old daughter, and she says, "Dad, that's stupid," because the brain is in the body, so you should never say embodied brain. But we always mean the brain that's distributed throughout the whole body, and she would be happy if I said it like that. Okay, so what's a relationship? Even like between a mother and a child. Let's start with that, or a relationship between a person and their community in the state. So it's a connection, okay? And when you say connection, what sense do you have of a connection of what to what, and how does that work?
An interdependency.
Okay, an interdependency. Okay, so of
People or people to community.
so people to community, people to people, people to the planet. So we can use the word relationship to how, let's just start from the point of view of an individual. An individual connects, is interdependent with other entities. And now that's a really weird word though. Other entities or other, like what is other? Not you. So what's you?
People in the cars in LA.
People in the cars in LA, for sure. It's very clear, they're in the other car, I'm in my car. You're you, I'm me, don't get near me. See, it's different when you have subways and things like that, where you actually know there are human beings. We think in terms of cars. Okay, but seriously, this is a really crucial question that shouldn't just be taken for granted.
It's a separate organism.
Okay, good. So we have the word organism, and here it becomes the really important issue. That if we throw in a word like self, let's just try the word self out there for a moment, and if a person defines the self as the boundaries of their skin, right? And I say, I am this body in this skin, right? So what do you know about psychology if I define a self that way? What am I bound to do? I can find another person, yes, I can connect to other people. I can also say, well, this body is only going to live 100 years, and so I better collect as many toys as possible before it dies, and then I'll win the game, right? So the way an individual defines that word is not a casual thing for the creation of cities, is what I want to point out. The word self is an incredibly important word. And we're going to come back to the neurobiology of self in a few minutes. But this is where you say, well, it's the self relating to something else. Well, so let's just say it that way for now, but let's put a red star by it, because we've got to come back to that. Because self is not something that should be taken for granted. If you have societies that make a person believe that the self, in fact, is defined by the skin, like in modern Western culture, you're going to have certain results of that, right? And yet, what do we know about all the studies of happiness? We know from the studies of happiness, wisdom, and longevity is that if you live a life where you define the self just by your skin, and you try to get as much hedonic pleasure and try to get as much stuff and material well-being and money and all that stuff, you have zero positive impact on those factors. No more wisdom, no more happiness, no more health. In contrast, what does health come from? What does happiness come from? What do all the studies of wisdom show? It shows that when a person realizes that they're interconnected and the self does not end at the skin, just to play with that word a little bit, that's when you get health and wisdom and happiness. So there's something really weird going on in a country like the United States, for example, or any of the Western countries, where you have more resources being used up and actually less happiness and less health. But this is one of the issues that I just want to point out to you when we get to mind in a moment, that the sense of self, which is really a mental outcome, could in fact be being distorted by culture. So if you're the people who are architects for cities, cities are the physical embodiment of cultural transmission. And so we know that painfully in LA because our city is so horribly designed that there's nothing structurally that encourages interconnectedness in LA. It's extremely sad. I mean, it's where I grew up, it's where I live, and it's just, you see it all the time, and you can see that it doesn't have to be that way. So I just want to point that out as we go forward. Okay, so just to get to the issue here, if the brain is electrochemical energy passage through the body, the embodied brain, I'm not supposed to say that, what's a relationship? It's an exchange, exactly. It's an exchange of, like what's happening now between me and you. What are we exchanging right at this moment? Words. Okay, so let's get really basic about it because this will help you understand what it would mean for a city. Like right now, what am I exchanging between myself and yourself? I know I'm using the self word, but sound. Okay, so at a very minimum, there's a big sound there. At a very minimum, it's sound. Now, what is sound? Sound is information, and before it gets to be information, because we'll define that in a moment, what is it even before it's information? It's energy. And just to be really specific, so we'll start from ground zero, it's vibration of air, right? And what other ways am I connecting with you right now? Visual. And what's visual? Photons, light energy. Okay. So you could say that relationship, you can play with this, is always the exchange of energy flow, and then the word information was brought up. So if I go, blah, 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 blah,
that's a spiritual connection.
there you go. I'm talking in tongues. But if I were to do that, would there be much information in that? No. In a certain way, we'll define that. There are features to it. This becomes really, really important. There are features, there are facets, there are aspects. You could measure it. But what we're going to say is those things are not information. So in cognitive science, what do we define as information? Well, an idea would be an example of information, absolutely. What else? How would you actually try to define information? I'll give you an example. Do any of you speak Greek? Okay, good. So watch this. Just you try this out. Empire State Building. That's demonstration number 1. Now watch this. Demonstration number 2. Glikanera. No, you speak Greek? Oh, it's a Greek word. It's a Greek word, but so now when I said Empire State Building, how many of you had an experience? Raise your hand. Okay, and what happened? You had an image. You had an image of the building. Now listen, watch this. Think about this. Empire State Building is simply the movement of air molecules, different from Eiffel Tower or Big Ben or whatever I might say. It's still the same energy, but a different pattern, right? So somehow the pattern of energy flow creates a picture of the Empire State Building or the Eiffel Tower or Big Ben or whatever. Information is something that stands for something other than itself. Now, in designing cities, this becomes not a trivial matter because the information that you embed in the structure of a city is going to have meaning. This is where meaning comes from. You extract from energy patterns shared symbolic meaning. Like, for example, these rental bike places. You could just say, oh, big deal, it's a place to ride bikes, but it's much more than that. You get a feeling when you see people just walking down the street, jumping on a bike together, that we're actually in this together. We're in this together to not use so much gas. I don't know a single thing, because people don't ride buses in LA for the most part. There's nothing like that in LA. There's no sense of joining. You just don't have it. So this symbolic meaning is crucial for how you shape culture. So information. So, okay, fine. So relationships are the sharing of energy, but sometimes that energy is information. So it's a little bit redundant because all information is energy, but not all energy is information. Glikanera, by the way, just means sweet water. And it's a beach on Crete. That's really quite lovely. But I won't get into the story about that. But it's a very nice beach. So Gli Kanara didn't have any information for you, but if you spoke Greek, it would. Now this becomes a really crucial thing in a moment when we get to mind, because you can see that it all depends on your experience whether you're getting information from something or not. Since you never learned Greek, you didn't have information from Gli Kanara. But I've been in audiences, let's say, where there are Greek speakers, and they're giggling their heads off because they know it's a nudist beach on Crete that they also went to. In fact, one time I was actually there at the same time as someone in the audience, which was kind of interesting. What year was I there? You were there too? 1982.
1970.
Okay, so you know Gli Kanara. Okay, that's it. So you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, they've got caves and there's sweet water, and it's a nudist colony. It's fantastic. Anyway, okay, I'll give you directions later. So the issue there is, how do you actually create information that's useful? All right, so relationships, sharing of energy and information flow, the brain, electrochemical energy and information flow. Now the issue is the mind. We've already said the mind has consciousness and awareness. We should also, would you feel comfortable saying that when you say mind, you mean subjective experience? Would that be okay? Like if I say, look at this red, like that, would it be fair to say that the way you experience red, your subjective inner experience, is a part of your mental life? No? Yes? No? Yeah. Okay. So we have this thing. It's really important just for understanding this issue is that the mind includes consciousness. No one knows what it is. No, people studying for 2,500 years in different traditions. No scientists, no neuroscientists, no meditators. Nobody knows what it is. Everyone knows what it is, but they don't know what it is. We know we have it. The same thing is true with subjective experience. No one on the planet knows what subjective experience is, even though everybody knows what it is. Right? So you can't reduce it to anything else. So what some philosophers, a person I work with named Michelle Bitball, and I were once at this week-long retreat on science and spirituality, and we're trying to resolve this problem, and we just said, let's call it a prime. Meaning you can't reduce it to anything else. You don't try to reduce subjective experience or consciousness into brain functioning or relational functioning or anything. You just say it's a prime, which you'll see why that's important to do that. But there is something that the mind can be looked at and actually studied, and that is, how does the mind, let's just start this way, is the mind related to the brain?
It's kind of like karma applied to the brain, not to sound too Californian.
Say it again, it's like what?
It's like karma applied.
Karma applied to the brain. All right, this is good. What does that mean?
Well, you have an experience, but you make choices based on your experience, and let's say you choose to learn Greek, and that becomes kind of your karma. So then that is so then you learn the Greek, and then that becomes part of your brain. So it's.
So they're reinforcing. They reinforce each other. Okay, absolutely, great. So these are reinforcing each other, but you're kind of implying that something like free will could get the brain to change.
Right.
Right.
Well, choice
or choice, right. And that's a really crucial point. So if you decide to meditate, for example, how many of you did the meditation this morning? Okay, so you did the Wheel of Awareness practice. You can show that a practice like that or similar practices will change the brain if you do it on a regular basis. Right? And we did things like that, a little different, for people with attention deficit problems at UCLA. Another center I run is the Mindful Awareness Research Center. And we were able to show you had more improvements with training the mind with meditation, mindfulness meditation, than you get with medications. It was an open pilot study. We have to repeat it, but the initial findings are really great. We're now at UCLA doing another study for people with bipolar disorder, a genetically acquired problem in the brain, and we're going to have them do mindfulness meditation because some studies of David Miklowitz, when he was at Oxford and in Colorado, and studies, things I've done too with individual cases, not in a sequential way, show that the way you choose to focus your mind actually can change the function and structure of the brain. So this becomes crucial if you're deciding, for example, how to shape a culture through a structure of a city. That
What do you mean by it changes the structure of the brain?
What I mean by that is you can show that, let's say mindfulness meditation, for example. You can do it in a number of ways. You can do an 8-week program, and the study of Hosel and colleagues that just came out a few weeks ago actually shows that within 8 weeks you are thickening certain regulatory areas of the brain that help control emotional regulation and attentional function after 8 weeks of practice. You can then also study, adepts, people have been meditating for 10, 20, 30 years, and show that the amount that they've meditated, it's not proactive because you didn't do a before study, but the inference is that the amount you meditated thickened certain it's always these regulatory areas of the brain. Now, it shouldn't be a surprise because meditation is basically a way that you're training the mind in mindfulness to regulate attention. And as you'll see, there's something very useful about mindfulness just as a general area to say, how do you actually change the brain to define the self as not just ending at the boundary of the skin? But I'm going to give you a little teaser for the future because we haven't defined the mind yet. But this is the amazing thing. We now know, a lot of the studies actually generated by things that happened in this room years ago, have now shown, in fact, that the way you focus your mind can change your brain in really helpful ways, even, as we've shown at UCLA, even if you have a genetically loaded psychiatric problem. So in our field, in my field, in psychiatry, this is like blowing everybody away because we've always been saying, well, if you have a genetically acquired problem, the only thing you do is write a prescription and give a pill. But now we're saying, no, hold on. The mind can change the brain throughout the lifespan. Now, what does that statement mean? Because we haven't defined the mind. So let's define the mind. So one thing we're saying is, that the mind has this thing called subjective experience. Okay? And we're not going to define that except you know what it is. It's the quality, the texture, the inner sense of something. Totally not measurable. Scientists cannot do anything with it because they can't measure it. But you know you have it. And if you see this red, we have no idea if the way you see red is the same as how I see red. There's no way to compare that. We just don't know. And so what happened in psychology about 100 years ago is they said, forget that. We're not going to study subjective experience because you can't measure it. And we're scientists, which is a really reasonable scientific stance to take. But unfortunately, what it did is it made a huge split between deep first-person accounts of mental life and measurable external behaviors. So this is why, for the last 100 years, this beautiful field called psychology actually didn't define the thing it's ologing. It didn't. I have a colleague of mine, a young student who just graduated with a degree in psychology from like a real fancy East Coast university, 2 degrees. She got a degree in cognitive neuroscience and a degree in psychology. So I said to her, this is fantastic. How many lectures did you have from your professors in psychology of like Psych 101 all the way up to your senior that defined the mind? In cognitive neuroscience, which is the neuroscience of the mind, or psychology? 0. Yeah.
What you're saying is very true, but it seems that's because scientists don't want to define the mind as different from the brain. They want to keep the mind as part of the brain process.
Exactly.
We're pulling it out, which is very interesting and for me to hear with a background in biology, but I'm not, I guess you'll get to the part.
Here, we're going to get to it. Yeah, we'll get to it right now. So this is the issue. You're pointing out the exact hot button issue. And the reason we've been kind of stuck, I'll just say, in these different academic fields is because of exactly what you're saying, is things had to be measurable, and then with the strengthening of neuroscience, people basically said, well, all that mental stuff is just an output of the brain, right? And so what we said in our Culture Brain Development Center is it's not that simple, because culture shapes the brain. The brain doesn't just shape culture. And that, of course, got a lot of people pissed off at us. So we've been doing this for 10 years and actually demonstrating the case of it. And now the data is in that the brain is always responding to experience, but we'll get to that in a moment. So here's what happened back in 1992. I was doing work in trauma, and I had been a research fellow in a bunch of different disciplines in memory research, and was working with anthropologists and stuff. And so I pulled together 40 scientists, and I said to them, let's study the beginning of the decade of the brain. What's the connection between the brain and the mind? That's the only question we'll answer. The brain was easy to define, just like we did. This goofy diagram you saw over there. And no one could agree on what the mind was. So in the intervening week before the next meeting, I came up with a working definition of the mind that I offered to them. And of these 40 scientists from 12 different disciplines, from anthropology to neuroscience and complexity theory and mathematicians and physicists and all sorts of people in the room, 100% of them agreed on the definition. It was bizarre. And instead of the group falling apart, it went on for 4.5 years. So this definition comes from that experience of working with those scientists. And it's really useful for what we're about to talk about, because here's the definition that I offered to them, and I'll give you the long version. One aspect of the mind, not subjective experience and not awareness, which no one can define, but let's just make sure we say those are parts of the mind too. We're going to get to thought in just a moment. So one aspect of the mind, because of course the mind has thoughts, feelings, intentions, beliefs, attitudes, hopes, dreams, wishes, longings, for sure. All of that we experience in subjective experience. But one aspect of the mind can be defined as an embodied, meaning it's not just in the skull, but it's throughout the whole body, and relational, whether it's your relationship to other people or the planet. An embodied and relational, self-organizing, emergent process, which I'm going to define in a moment, that regulates the flow of energy and information. So to say it really simply, it's an embodied and relational process that emerges from relationships and the embodied brain. And in this emergence, it's doing something called self-organization. And self-organization is just a term straight out of the mathematics of something called complex systems, where you can actually study how the interaction of elements of a system gives rise to a property. In this case, it's called self-organization. And what self-organization does is it regulates the thing that's the essence of the system. In this case, this triangle becomes energy and information flow. Flow being defined as the movement across time. Energy we've defined, well, we haven't defined it, we've given examples. A physicist would say that energy is the capacity to do stuff, sometimes work, sometimes not. So basically, this becomes a triangle of energy and information flow. And to be very specific about it, that's the system we're looking at. So a relationship is the sharing of that flow. The brain is the embodied mechanism of that flow. And arising in a self-organizational process is the mind. Now, this has huge implications, because once you say that the mind is regulatory, then you have some really incredible opportunities to do something intentionally to create a healthier mind. See, before, when it was just as, because I'm also trained as a biologist, and we say, oh, the brain gives rise to the mind, oh well, let's study the brain, which is why brain scientists get so much fame, and they get so much money, and they get so much lab space, because we all had this feeling like, oh, the brain's the source of everything. It's not that simple. And believe me, I get in lots of fights with brain scientists who don't like this thinking, because they want to think, first of all, they want to think the brain is the whole thing, but also they want to think that you own your mind. But it's a very insular kind of way of picturing what mental life is. So we're saying it's an embodied and relational, with that being a huge term, relational. So it's not just with other people, it can be, as I said, with the planet. So an embodied and relational, and here's the key thing, it's a self-organizing, which has a whole science to it. Well, self-protecting would be a part of adaptation, for sure, and we'll talk about that. Self-organizing, emergent, these are just the scientific terms, process. So this is something that becomes crucial, and then we have a self-organizing process that, what does it do? It's regulating. This is the key thing. Regulating energy and information flow. Now, when I was teaching in England and in Holland, people would say, well, how does the mind affect the brain? I don't get that. If the mind is coming from, at least in part, the brain, how does it turn back and affect the brain? And this is basically exactly what an emergent process does. The fancy word for it is called re-entry. The process itself can go back and affect, for example, culture in our relationships. You know, whether you work at the level of building cities or changing public policy in the Congress, you are going back in a re-entry loop where the emergent process actually, in a sense, takes on a life of its own and influences relationships and influences the connections in the brain. I mean, a perfect example with absolute proof is mindfulness meditation. You know, you take a process like people taking time in, if you just want to call it that, to actually get away from all the external stimuli and go inward, you can show the immune system improves, empathy increases. If they're clinicians, their burnout decreases. They maintain positive connections to other people. You know, I've done a bunch of scientist retreats where you can show, even though you're not trying to make people more compassionate, the scientists become more compassionate, which is always a miracle. You know, it's actually amazing. And I can show you a reasoning, or actually I've written 2 books about why I think that happens, but I'll explain it to you in a nutshell. But this is the issue. So if you're thinking about, let's say, you say, well, how does this have to do with like organizing a city? You know, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but you could actually say that a city is a place-based instead of embodied, self-organizing, emergent place and process that regulates the flow of energy, information, and material.
Totally. Exactly what I was about to say. Thank you. But not that well. But that's it. That's exactly the idea. So that a city actually creates that play space. So this is why, I mean, when I was flying here and I was thinking, okay, you know, actually, you know, I was thinking, what am I going to say that's different from what happened before and helpful in some way? I mean, just really spending time just on this one chart here is exactly what Jonathan said. You see, what you do with cities, or what you guys did in Portland with communities, it's a whole game changer. There's these re-entry processes where if you start having people experience what it's like to be a member of a community, and I'm gonna show you 2 more principles before we get into some of the brain details, which I think are important. But the first thing I just want to say about this definition is, as Jonathan is saying, the city can shape the embodiment and the relationality of how mind emerges. I mean, just take the London thing. When I hopped on that bike, I just felt literally as I'm bicycling along, and you know, when we do these shared behavioral things, there's a whole system in the brain called the mirror neuron system. And you know, you can show that in literally your nervous system, when you see someone doing something, bless you, when you see someone doing something, I don't want to call it a ritualized way, but a patterned behavior that then becomes shared, drumming is an example, dancing, singing together. You can show that this system in the brain, which is studied in Italy originally, we studied a lot at UCLA, called the mirror neuron system, allows you to see another human being, they start doing something, you start doing a similar kind of thing. Let's say even we're riding along on bikes, and there's a sense of becoming a part of a we, which changes everything. Changes everything. I had a dear friend named John O'Donohue who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. John was a former Catholic priest, and on his retreats he was a poet and a mystic and a wonderful, wonderful guy. Anyway, one of the things John was really interested in was all this stuff about the brain. So he was doing a Catholic Mass, and everyone was feeling really close to each other and connected. And John was doing the Mass and everything like that. And I said, John, this is a great example of mirror neuron activation. And he goes, what are you talking about? I said, let's do the whole thing again with all the sense of belonging that your congregants here feel. Let's do it again. And let me set it up where they can't see that they're doing the same behaviors. And let's see how they feel. He goes, okay. Everybody, we're doing a mirror neuron experiment, he said. And then we got everybody together, we did it again. No one felt the same kind of closeness with each other. So in terms of designing cities, and LA, I hate bashing my town. I've lived most of my life there, but there's no opportunity for mirror neuron resonance. None. There's no way where people actually get together in a setting where they're doing, and just name it, they're not literally building relational connections of resonating with people in their communities. And we evolved, as you know, to live in groups of anywhere from 50 to 150, so let's just say 100 people, where you know people, you see them face to face, you feel connected to them, and you don't feel isolated like we do in modern urban life. Yeah?
So then what's the difference, we've all felt it, what's the difference of being in your car and seeing everyone else in their car, and being on a bike and seeing everyone else on a bike, and feeling more connected to them? Like, why don't, when we get in our car and we see everyone else in their car enjoying their music and whatever else, why don't we say, wow, I feel so connected with everyone because we're all in our cars?
Yeah, that's a great question. What do you think? What do you think?
Well, I think, I don't know.
Let's say maybe there is no difference. I mean, I know I feel a difference.
You can't see them.
You can't see a person in a car. Yeah. Well,
Get out of the way! Like, this is one of the places where interaction does happen in LA, right? You stop at the light, you look over, you're like, hey, oh, maybe that's a cute guy, cute girl in the next car. That's when you can make eye contact.
at the stopping, right?
You know what? It's the intensity of having me.
So
But that's
it-
one place where it does happen, is because you can stop and see. Usually you're going too fast and you can't.
Absolutely.
Bumper stickers is the other.
Oh, bumper stickers, right. That's right. It's kind of a sad statement, but yes. But yeah, I have a bunch to say about that. Let's go around and see what people think. Yes?
I think it's the solidarity of experience too, and the more unusual that experience is, the more you're in solidarity with someone else having it. The way, when I'm in DC, I don't look at somebody else from DC and say, hey, wow, we're both from DC. But if I meet up with them in Guatemala, I'm going to feel like, hey, wow, we're both from DC, and we share that.
Yeah.
And that's going to be sort of something we groove on. But I think that when everybody's in their cars, you don't feel that solidarity with someone else in their car.
You don't really feel it, and literally there's no embodiment of it, because you're literally just seeing these hands and stuff like that. I mean, and so like when we stop at a light, and we're all waiting for these weird London traffic lights, whatever they do, I can't really still figure them out, but we're all on our bikes, and maybe I'm just delusional about it, but there was this feeling like, okay, we're all stopped. You could feel everyone breathing, and you were just there, literally embodying the experience in a way. Also, when you're traveling, you wake up, you see people. Yeah.
You describe that as the relationship as an exchange of energy.
Yes.
And there would be, when you're entombed in a car, there's no sound.
No sound.
Visual energy is impaired in some way. So if you understand the relationship as an exchange of energy, then you would understand why you feel isolated.
Why it would be different? It's profoundly isolated. Yes.
Also, I think your ability to exchange information, because I can feel more connected to somebody that I'm communicating with on Facebook than I would be sitting next to them in a car, because the connection, your ability, the conduit for exchanging information is much clearer.
Exactly. And this, you've just helped me understand why in LA, maybe you have in other cities, they have these big signs on the freeway saying, "Do not text while you're driving." And I'm looking at this sign, I'm going, what an insane sign. But now I understand why they have to do that. Because people feel so isolated unless they're texting that they would rather actually text and die than to just drive and live but be isolated and be dead. Thank you. Yes?
I also think there's a sense of novelty, and it's meaningful. Like if you go to a subway in New York, they're all next to each other, it doesn't matter, everybody's inner. But because you're in a novel setting, and it's probably novel to people in London still because it's probably a fairly new system, it's not so much the action, it's what it represents that's connecting you all together in a way that taking the subway even in New York.
Well, that's a very interesting point, because certainly I was just talking to some people who were in Tokyo before the disaster, and certainly my experience in Japan and New York is that same way. In a setting like a subway, you create all these neural adaptations to not connect with people, because it'll be threatening, or they'll pick your pocket, or they'll say, "What are you looking at me for?" or whatever like that. So maybe, and so it could be novelty, or it could also be that certain things were too jammed in with each other. Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
I think that I wonder if there's sort of a tipping point in numbers, because, if I'm going on a hike on a bigger trail and I see another family, I go, "Hey, how you doing?" But if there were like 10,000 people walking on this trail, I feel like I would be on the subway. It was like, that there's sort of a critical mass beyond which we don't have that distance.
Exactly. So in London, just to give you more examples, in Hyde Park, the weather was exquisite this last week, and I was busy finishing a book and writing, but I would take breaks to go to the park, and I would go for walking. There would be large groups of people playing ball and frisbee and running around with dogs in small little groups, right? It was really beautiful. And then as the royal wedding, which is happening tomorrow, everyone was getting excited about it. The entire park was getting converted for about 200,000 or 300,000 people. They're expecting to descend on the park, where they're going to have giant screens, and it'll probably be more like what you're saying. It'll be throngs of anonymous faces again, no space to actually literally connect like that. So it's an important issue of, when this system of connectedness can be created. So in terms of city planning, you don't want to have something where you're going to have throngs and throngs of people just like that. It needs to be some way where people can communicate and exchange energy and information that's meaningful. In other settings like the subway, we have to shut it down. Someone was waiting there, yes?
A couple of interesting thoughts on that. I mean, I've experienced the same thing on a scooter. I ride a motorized scooter a lot, and I've experienced the same thing. So I really...
Which say same thing, which is...
Same thing as you do it on the bicycle. Mm-hmm. And it's not just with other scooter drivers, but it's also a different experience of the city and what's happening in the city. And I think it's because of a different sense of awareness of what's around you, because you are not you're not limiting the energy flow to yourself by being in a box that's completely enclosed. It also would be interesting to me, given the notion that we were just hearing about, sort of the novelty of it, to go to a place like Denmark, where something like 30% of the people ride bicycles, and to figure out and to research whether they, in fact, are experiencing the same thing as the riders in Washington, D.C., or London, or New York are with shared bike programs.
That would be fascinating, and you could probably find someone who will study that. It's a good idea. Yes?
Well, I think one interesting thing about the subway is that it can have both characteristics depending on what time of the week you're there. If you're in a subway train on a Wednesday morning, there could be 200 people in a car, and it's dead silent, and people are closing their eyes to tune each other out. You can be in the same car with the same amount of people on Saturday, and everybody's talking because it's groups of people who are in there together, and they're not going to work, they're going somewhere else and actually know people in the subway car. So I just not necessarily, obviously you can't really have a ladder experience in a car, but I think automobile, but I think it's interesting that you can have both.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That the social, the social connectedness it seems like it's more than just the structure, let's say, of the subway in that case. Absolutely. Yeah.
Isn't it really cultural too, though? Because I lived in LA and lived more than like you live, but I have a whole bunch of friends who are Mexican who lived in very similar houses in another part of town. They had the same thing, but they were all connected because they knew each other, they were families.
Absolutely.
It's a whole different structure. And
Totally.
So there's two different LAs first.
Many more than two, right?
And so white LA is really different than the rest of LA.
What makes you think I'm white? Yes.
If race were real.
Yeah.
Okay. And then
No, that's right.
That's one other topic.
Yeah.
But and then culturally, you can be just depending upon who you are. I will be in a group of people and be happy because I'm connected to all these other people, and someone else could be standing right next to me, experience the same sensory things, and feel totally isolated because everybody else around them they think is connected.
Absolutely. So we have something called temperament, and we do have different proclivities. Right. So let's do this. Let me take one more thing, and then I want to keep on moving forward. Yes.
Yeah, I was just curious what you think about the idea of trying to control your environment in the context of these different stories. I mean, if if you're on a bicycle and you're outside next to people, you kind of, many parts of your environment that you don't have control over, whereas you're in a car, you can sort of control your environment. You're in a subway, you can put your headphones on, or you can pick up your New Yorker, and you can sort of kind of,
So some people use the word agency, self-agency, like how you can actually affect a change on something. And for a lot of people, that's extremely important, and a feeling of not being in control makes them feel horrible. Yeah, totally. I mean, so that becomes really important.